The auction lasted under a minute because nobody wanted 12 acres of dead apple trees, and when Ruth Calloway raised her hand at $200, the man beside her laughed. The county had tried to sell the old Pritchard orchard for 3 years, and every buyer who walked it said the land was not worth the back taxes. Ruth drove out to the orchard that same afternoon while the neighbors at the feed store were still talking about what a fool she was. She walked every row before dark, running her hands along bark that everyone else had written off, looking for something the county never recorded. 1 year later, the agricultural board showed up at her gate, and what they found in those rows changed how the county thinks about apples. The Pritchard orchard was the last lot on the county tax sale docket that October morning, and by the time the auctioneer reached it, most of the room had already left. The courthouse smelled like wet coats and gas station coffee, and the folding chairs were more than half empty. Wendell Fry had been running the county sales for 22 years, and he could tell when a lot was dead before he read the first line of the description. He knew this one. He picked up the file and adjusted his glasses. Parcel 14, the old Pritchard property, 12 acres, former orchard. He paused because he knew what was coming next. Abandoned approximately 28 years, no maintained road access, sold for unpaid back taxes totaling $197. The room didn't move. A man in the back row shifted his weight and looked at the clock on the wall, and someone near the door leaned toward the person beside him with a smile that said the lot was going to pass. Wendell tried again, asking the room for an opening bid at the tax amount, and nobody raised a card or spoke up or shifted in their chair. Ruth Calloway was sitting in the third row with her hands folded in her lap, and she raised one hand without standing up.
"I'll bid 200.
Wendell looked at her, and then he looked around the room one more time, because the rules said he had to give everyone a chance. Nobody countered. Nobody even glanced in her direction. $200. Opening bid accepted. Going once, going twice. Sold to bidder number 31. The gavel came down, and the man beside Ruth, a dairy farmer named Carl Sayers, who she had known for 15 years, turned to her with an expression that was half amusement and half pity. "You just bought yourself an orchard full of firewood, Ruth." She folded the bid slip and put it in her coat pocket.
"I guess we'll find out."
Carl shook his head and stood up to leave, and as he walked toward the door, a few people glanced at Ruth with the same look they gave anyone who made a decision the rest of them couldn't follow. It wasn't cruel. It was the comfortable certainty of people who knew what dead trees looked like and didn't need a second opinion. Outside the courthouse, Dale Harper was leaning against the railing with a cup of coffee, and he had waited there specifically to talk to her. Dale ran the largest commercial apple operation in the valley, 80 acres of Gala and Honeycrisp on dwarfing rootstock, and he had walked the Pritchard property himself 2 years earlier when the county first tried to sell it. He had looked at the same trees Ruth just bought, and he had decided they weren't worth the drive out there. "You actually bought that place," Dale said, and it wasn't a question.
"I did,"
Ruth said. He took a sip of his coffee and looked toward the hills where the Pritchard orchard sat, invisible from town but known to everyone in the valley. "Ruth, those trees have been gone since before I started planting. The whole property has grown up in brush, and you'd spend more clearing it than the land is worth." Ruth unlocked her truck and opened the door. "I'm not planning to clear it." Dale stared at her. "Then what are you planning to do with it?" She put one foot on the running board and looked at him the way she looked at most people who told her what something was worth before they had examined it. "I'll let you know come spring." She drove out to the orchard before the ink on the deed was dry, and the neighbors at the feed store spent the rest of the afternoon explaining to each other why she had made a mistake. The Pritchard orchard sat at the end of a gravel road that the county had stopped grading years ago, and the last half-mile was nothing but rutted dirt and volunteer brush that had grown waist-high across the track. Ruth's truck bottomed out twice in the ruts before she reached the gate, which was a rusted wire affair hanging from a single post. She tied it open with baling twine and drove through. From the road, the orchard looked exactly like everyone said it did. The trees were skeletal, their canopies broken and tangled with wild grapevine and multiflora rose that had grown up through the branches and pulled them sideways. Half of them leaned at angles that said the root system was half gone, and the other half stood straight but bare, their bark splitting and peeling in long strips. Anyone driving past would see a graveyard of wood and keep driving. Ruth didn't look at the tops of the trees. She walked to the first row and knelt down in the wet leaves, and she put her hands on the trunk about 6 inches above the soil line where the graft union sat. The graft union is the scar where a fruiting variety was joined to a rootstock decades ago, and every named apple in the world exists because someone made that cut and bound the two pieces together. Apples don't come true from seed, which means a seed from a northern spy won't produce a northern spy tree. It will produce something random, and usually worse. The only way to keep a variety alive is to graft it, and the graft union is the evidence that someone, at some point, decided this particular apple was worth preserving. Ruth ran her thumb across the scar tissue on the first tree, and it was thick and rough and alive. The top of the tree was dead, snapped off about 4 feet up by wind or ice, but the trunk below the graft was solid, and when she scratched the bark with her thumbnail, she found green cambium underneath. She moved to the next tree and did the same thing. Dead top, living trunk. She moved to the third and the fourth and the fifth, working her way down the row on her knees in the cold mud, and by the 10th tree she had stopped calling it a dead orchard in her head. These trees weren't dead. They were sleeping, and nobody had bothered to wake them up. She stood up and wiped her hands on her jeans and started looking at the graft unions differently. Not just alive or dead, but what variety. The bark texture, the lenticel pattern, the angle of the buds, the shape of the few dried leaves still clinging to the water sprouts that had grown from the base. All of it was information. Ruth had spent 20 years learning to read it. The front rows were planted with varieties she recognized, common commercial stock from the 1950s and 1960s, the kinds of apples you could still buy at any nursery in the state. But as she moved deeper into the orchard, the trees changed. The trunks got wider, the graft unions older, and the bark patterns became ones she had only seen in old reference books and once or twice in the back rows of abandoned homesteads she had explored with a forestry group a decade ago. The back 3 rows were the oldest, and their trunks were the widest of all, some of them 15 inches across at the graft union. These trees weren't from the 1950s. They were from the original planting, the ones the Pritchard family put in the ground when they settled the land in the 1880s, and Ruth couldn't identify a single one of them from the bark alone. She pulled the notebook she always carried in her back pocket and started numbering trees, row by row, sketching bark patterns and bud shapes and noting which rootstocks were alive and which were gone. She worked until the light went flat and the cold came up off the ground. By the time she walked back to the truck, she had cataloged 87 living rootstocks across 12 acres of trees that the entire county had agreed were dead. She didn't smile, and she didn't tell anyone what she found. She drove home in the dark and put the notebook on her kitchen table, and she sat with it for a long time before she went to bed. The county agricultural extension agent, Phil Marsh, heard about the sale the next morning because the county heard everything immediately and passed it along at the speed of a phone tree. He called Ruth and asked if he could come out to see the property, and Ruth told him he could come whenever he wanted. Phil drove out on a Thursday in a white county truck with a magnetic door sign, and he brought a clipboard and a folder of replanting recommendations printed on county letterhead. He wasn't a bad man, and he wasn't stupid, but he had been trained in a system that had one answer for every orchard, and the answer was always the same. Clear the ground, replant with certified commercial stock on dwarfing rootstock, plant in high-density blocks, spray on a schedule, and manage for maximum yield. He walked the rows with Ruth, and he saw what she saw, the living rootstocks and the old graft unions, and the back rows of trees he couldn't identify. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at his clipboard. "Ruth, I'll be straight with you. These trees are too far gone to rehabilitate. The tops are dead on most of them, the canopies are a mess, and you've got brush growing through everything. The county recommends clearing and replanting." Ruth was checking a graft union on a tree in the 4th row. "What varieties do you recommend?" Phil flipped to a page on his clipboard. Gala, Honeycrisp, maybe some Fuji for late season, all on dwarfing rootstock. You'd get production in 3 years, uniform fruit, and the buyers know what they're getting. Ruth pointed at the old trees in the back rows. "What about those? What were they planted as?" Phil checked the county file, and the variety list was blank. The registration from 1948 said, "Mixed orchard, commercial and heritage stock," and nothing else. Nobody had ever recorded what was planted here, because nobody had thought it mattered. "Those are heritage varieties, Ruth. They have no commercial value. The market wants uniform fruit, and these trees haven't produced a crop in decades." Phil closed his clipboard and looked at her the way he looked at every grower who told him they were going to do something different. "I've been doing this for 18 years, and I've never seen a neglected orchard come back. The textbooks say you replant, and I'm telling you what works." Ruth thanked him for coming and walked him to his truck, and he drove away shaking his head. The county heard about the visit within a day because Phil mentioned it at the extension office, and the extension office was connected to every feed store and diner in the valley. By the following Saturday, the story had made the rounds at Harper's Feed and Supply. Dale Harper was holding court near the coffee pot, and the details had grown in the telling. "She's going to graft those dead trees," Dale told the group, and several people laughed. Phil Marsh told her to bulldoze and replant, and she told him she's not selling to the market. A retired dairy farmer named Wayne Riddle leaned back in his chair. "So what's she going to do? Eat the apples herself?" "Somebody said she's ordering grafting supplies from 3 counties over," another man added, "spending more on tools than she spent on the land." Ruth wasn't at the feed store that morning, and she wouldn't have responded if she had been. She spent the weekend ordering scionwood collection tools, grafting tape, and sealing wax from a supplier in the next county, and she pulled her old pruning manual off the shelf and read it cover to cover for the first time in 5 years. Over the winter, while the orchard sat frozen under 2 feet of snow, Ruth worked on identification. She had her notebook with 87 living rootstocks numbered and sketched, and she spread it on the kitchen table next to a stack of reference books she had collected over 20 years of studying old orchards. The Pritchard family had homesteaded the property in the 1880s, and Ruth found their name in the county history book, listed among the original homesteaders who cleared the valley for farming. They planted apples for eating, for cider, for winter storage, and for sale at the local market, the way every farm family did in those days. A homestead orchard wasn't a commercial operation. It was a survival strategy, and the varieties were chosen for what they could do, not for what they looked like. Ruth cross-referenced the bark patterns and bud shapes she had recorded with a regional heirloom identification guide published by a university extension service, and she sent leaf samples from the surviving water sprouts to a plant identification lab at the state university. The lab could run genetic comparisons against known cultivars, and Ruth had used the service twice before on old trees she found on abandoned properties. While she waited for the results, she worked through the reference books tree by tree. The front rows were easy, the commercial varieties from the mid-20th century that she had expected. But the back rows were something else entirely. She identified one variety as a cider apple that had been common in the valley in the early 1900s, but hadn't been commercially available since the 1940s. Another matched a winter storage variety listed in old orchard catalogs as an excellent keeper that ripened in October and stored until March, a description that no modern commercial variety could match, because modern apples were bred for shipping and shelf appearance, not for months of storage without refrigeration. 2 trees in the far back row matched nothing in any book she owned. She checked 3 catalogs, 2 university databases, and a regional heirloom registry, and none of them recognized the bark pattern, the bud shape, or the leaf characteristics she had recorded. She had 2 trees that might be varieties no one had cataloged in living memory, growing unrecorded in a dead orchard that the county had tried to sell for 3 years. She contacted a nonprofit called the Heritage Apple Preservation Project, a group that tracked lost and rediscovered varieties across the eastern United States. The woman she spoke to, a botanist named Sarah Chen, told her that old homestead orchards were one of the last places where forgotten varieties survived, because nobody had bothered to record what the original families planted, and the trees kept growing for decades after the families were gone. Sarah asked how many trees were in the back rows that Ruth couldn't identify from the reference material. Ruth told her about 20, and 2 that didn't match anything in the databases. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Those 2 could be varieties that were thought to be lost. It happens more than people realize. A family plants a tree in 1890, nobody writes it down, the orchard gets abandoned, and the tree keeps growing for 100 years while everyone forgets it exists. Ruth sat with that for a while after she hung up the phone. She had bought the orchard because she saw living rootstock where everyone else saw dead wood, but she hadn't expected to find varieties that might not exist anywhere else. The orchard was a living archive of apple genetics that the commercial industry had discarded and the county had never documented, and Ruth understood that now in a way she hadn't when she raised her hand at the auction. She also understood why the mixed planting mattered, though she had understood it in her hands before she understood it in words. Every variety in the orchard responded differently to disease, to cold, to drought, to insects. The Pritchard family hadn't planted one variety in a 1,000-tree block. They had planted a dozen varieties side by side, because that was how you ensured against losing everything in one bad year. Diversity wasn't an accident. It was the way apples were grown before anyone decided that uniformity was more important than survival. February came in cold and clear, and Ruth drove out to the orchard on a morning when the thermometer read 19 degrees. She carried a sharp knife, a bundle of damp cloth, and a roll of labeling tape, and she spent 3 hours cutting scionwood from the healthiest surviving branches on each tree. Scionwood is the cutting that carries the genetic identity of the variety, pencil-thick sections with 3 or 4 dormant buds, cut in deep winter while the tree is asleep and the wood isn't actively growing. You collect it in February, wrap it in damp cloth, store it in the back of a refrigerator at about 35 degrees, and you wait for spring when the rootstock starts pushing sap and the graft can heal. Ruth cut scionwood from every living tree in the orchard, including the 2 unidentified varieties in the back row. She labeled every bundle with the tree number from her notebook, sealed them in plastic bags with damp paper towel, and put them in the crisper drawer of her refrigerator, where they would sit for 6 weeks until grafting season. She also cut extra scionwood from the 2 unidentified trees, because she wasn't going to take any chances with varieties that could be lost forever if she failed. March arrived with the first warm days, and Ruth began pruning. She started with the front rows, the younger commercial stock, and she worked methodically, removing dead wood, thinning the tangled canopies to let light in, and cutting back the water sprouts that had grown wild from the base of every tree. She didn't prune hard. Old trees that have been neglected for decades can die from aggressive pruning, because the shock of losing too much canopy at once is more than the root system can handle. The manual she had reread said to spread the work over 2 or 3 seasons, taking 1/3 of the canopy at a time, and Ruth followed it the way she followed every instruction that had been tested by someone with dirt under their fingernails. The back rows were harder. The old trees had trunks thick enough that she needed a pruning saw for the main cuts, and the canopies were so overgrown that she spent an entire day on 3 trees. She hauled the cut wood out by hand and piled it at the fence line, and by the end of each day her arms were scratched from wrist to shoulder, and her back ached from the ladder work. Nobody came to help, and nobody offered, because the county had written the orchard off, and Ruth hadn't asked anyone for anything. Asking would have invited the conversation she didn't want to have about what she was doing and why, and she wasn't ready to have that conversation with anyone who hadn't put their hands on the bark first. In April, she began cleft grafting. The technique is old and simple in concept, though it takes a steady hand in practice. You take a rootstock whose top is died, but whose base is alive. You cut the stump flat, split it down the middle with a grafting chisel, and insert 2 scionwood cuttings, one on each side of the split, aligning the cambium layer of the scion with the cambium layer of the rootstock. If the layers touch and the graft heals, the scion grows as part of the tree and the variety continues on a living root system. Ruth grafted the way she did everything, methodically and without ceremony. She cut, split, inserted, sealed with grafting wax, and wrapped each union with parafilm tape. Some took and some didn't, and she grafted more than she needed because she expected a 30% failure rate on old rootstock, and she wasn't going to lose a variety because she only tried once. By the 3rd week of April, she had grafted over 100 unions, and she was losing more than she expected on the oldest rootstock in the back rows. 3 of the Pritchard trees rejected every scion she tried, the grafts drying out and cracking before the cambium could fuse. She stood in front of the 3rd failure with her knife in her hand and her knees in the mud, and the quiet, cold awareness that she might lose varieties she couldn't replace if the rootstocks wouldn't take another graft. She went back to her nursery that evening and grafted the last of the scionwood from those 3 trees onto fresh rootstock, the backup trees she'd already started. By the end of the week, those grafts were swelling. The varieties would survive even if the original rootstocks wouldn't cooperate, and it wasn't the outcome she wanted, but it was the outcome she had planned for. For the 2 unidentified trees, she took the extra scionwood and grafted it onto clean rootstock in her backyard nursery, creating backup trees that would carry the variety even if the originals died. This was insurance, the kind that nobody in the county would understand, because it meant she was preserving varieties she couldn't sell, couldn't name, and couldn't explain to anyone who asked what she was growing. She didn't tell anyone about the backup trees. She just did the work, through the cold and the mud and the long, quiet days of early spring, grafting and pruning and checking and regrafting, alone in an orchard that was slowly, row by row, coming back to life. By late May, the orchard was greening in a way that no one driving past would have recognized. The pruned trees had pushed new growth from the limbs Ruth had opened to light, and the canopy was still thin and ragged compared to a managed orchard, but it was alive, and it was growing. Ruth walked the rows on a Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and her notebook, checking each graft union by hand. She pressed the bark around the graft gently, testing whether the scion had fused with the rootstock, and she looked for the swelling buds that meant the graft had taken and the variety was growing. Most of them had. The cleft grafts on the younger rootstock in the front rows took at a higher rate, maybe 70%, and the ones that failed she regrafted with her remaining scionwood. The back rows were slower, because the old rootstocks were slower to callus, but 4 of the original Pritchard trees had accepted grafts and were pushing their first new growth in decades. The old trees that Ruth had only pruned, not grafted, responded the fastest. Their root systems were deep and wide, 80 years of growth stored underground, and the pruning had told them to send energy upward. They pushed water sprouts and new branches with a force that surprised Ruth, because she had expected the old trees to take years to respond, and instead they were acting like they had been waiting for someone to cut the dead wood out and let them breathe. A few of the back row trees bloomed in mid-May, sparse clusters of white flowers on wood that hadn't produced a blossom in years. Ruth didn't expect fruit this season, because the trees needed time to rebuild their canopy before they could carry a crop, and a tree that blooms too hard after renovation can exhaust itself. But the blossoms meant the wood was alive, the buds were viable, and the variety was preserved. She stood at the back fence and looked across the orchard in the early morning light. It wasn't restored, and it would take 3 to 5 years before the trees were productive again, and longer before the orchard looked like anything other than a collection of pruned skeletons with new growth sticking out at odd angles. But it was alive. Every variety she had identified was still growing, and the 2 unnamed varieties were blooming for the first time since anyone had bothered to notice. Ruth drank her coffee and made notes in her book. She didn't feel triumph because triumph required an audience, and she didn't have one. She felt something quieter than that, the feeling of walking through a room you have cleaned after years of neglect and seeing that the floors underneath were solid the whole time. She packed up her thermos and drove home, and the orchard sat in the morning sun, green and quiet and growing while the rest of the valley went about its business. What Ruth didn't know was that the same warm, wet spring that was bringing her trees back to life was also building perfect conditions for something else, something that would strip the commercial orchards bare before summer was over. June brought heat and humidity, and the wet spring that had been good for Ruth's orchard turned out to be devastating for everyone else. Fire blight is a bacterial disease that hits apples and pears, and it thrives in exactly the conditions the valley had that year: warm days, frequent rain, and high humidity during bloom. The first reports came from the commercial block south of town, where Dale Harper's Gala and Honeycrisp plantings stood in solid rows. The infection started in one block and moved through the trees like fire through dry grass, which is how the disease got its name. The blossoms wilted first, collapsing and turning black as if someone had held a torch to them. Then the shoots curled, the tips bending into the characteristic shepherd's crook shape that every orchardist recognizes with a sinking feeling. A brownish, sticky fluid oozed from the infected bark, and the bacteria spread through the vascular system of the tree, killing cambium and moving down the branch toward the trunk. In a monoculture block, where every tree is the same variety on the same rootstock, fire blight moves tree to tree with nothing to stop it. Every tree is equally susceptible, the spacing is tight, and the uniform canopy creates a continuous path for rain splash and insects to carry the bacteria from one infection point to the next. Dale watched a full row of 6-year-old gala trees go black in a week. He called Phil Marsh, and Phil called the Agricultural Board, and within 3 days the Extension Office had sent alerts to every grower in the county. The recommendation was streptomycin spray, the antibiotic that had been the standard fire blight treatment for decades. But when the growers applied it, the results were uneven. Some local populations of the bacteria had developed resistance to streptomycin over years of routine spraying, and the antibiotic that used to stop the disease cold was now only partially effective. Phil organized emergency meetings at the Extension Office, and the room was full of growers who had never seen fire blight this bad. Some of them lost entire blocks. The young trees on dwarfing rootstock were the most vulnerable because they had no reserves, no deep roots, no decades of stored energy to fight back with. The blight killed them to the ground, and the growers pulled them out with tractors and piled them for burning. The County Agricultural Board convened a special session, and the discussion was tense. They talked about quarantine zones and removal orders for infected blocks, and about replanting recommendations for the growers who had lost everything. But the replanting recommendations were the same ones they had been giving for 20 years, the same 5 varieties on the same dwarfing rootstocks, planted in the same high-density blocks that had just burned. Nobody in the meeting mentioned diversity or mixed plantings. The old Pritchard orchard on the gravel road at the end of the valley didn't come up either, even though Ruth Calloway was out there checking her grafts and watching the news from town with the quiet attention of someone who had read enough old books to see trouble coming. Ruth knew what fire blight did to a monoculture. She also knew what it didn't do to a mixed orchard, where every other tree was a different variety with different susceptibility, and where the blight couldn't hop from tree to tree because the next tree wasn't the same kind of apple. She had a few infected branches in her own orchard, single hits that she pruned out and burned, but the disease couldn't establish a foothold and spread because the architecture of the orchard wouldn't let it. She didn't call anyone, and she didn't go to the meetings. She pruned out the infected wood and went back to checking grafts, and she waited to see what the county would do when they ran out of things to spray. It was a county board member named Harold Fenn who mentioned the orchard. He had been driving the valley roads assessing the blight damage, counting the black rows and the burning piles, and he drove past the Pritchard place on his way back to town. He stopped his truck on the gravel road and looked through the windshield for a long time. Every other orchard in the valley was black, or being pulled out, and the Pritchard orchard was green. Harold brought it up at the next board meeting, and the room went quiet. Phil Marsh, who had told Ruth to bulldoze and replant 6 months earlier, said nothing for a long time. Then he told the board he would go out and take a look. He drove out on a Tuesday morning with 2 inspectors from the state agricultural office, and they arrived at Ruth's gate without calling ahead. Ruth was in the 5th row, checking a cleft graft that had pushed 8 inches of new growth, and she saw the White County truck stop at the fence. She recognized Phil behind the wheel, and she went back to her graft. Phil and the 2 inspectors walked through the gate and found her on their own. They stood at the end of the row and watched her work for a moment before Phil spoke. "Ruth, the board sent us out. We need to look at the orchard." She stepped back from the graft and wiped her palms on her jeans. "Go ahead and look." Phil walked the rows the way he had walked them 6 months ago, but this time he wasn't looking at a clipboard. He was looking at the trees, and what he saw was green canopy, new growth, healthy bark, and no fire blight collapse. He did find 1 infected branch on a tree in the 3rd row, a single strike that had been pruned out and sealed, but there was no block-wide devastation and no shepherd's crook running through the rows. The disease was present in the valley, but it couldn't move through this orchard the way it moved through Dale Harper's gala blocks. One of the inspectors, a plant pathologist named Dr. Annika Rao, knelt down and examined the graft unions. She looked at Ruth and asked if she had grafted these herself. Ruth nodded and told her she had started in April with cleft grafts on surviving rootstock. Dr. Rao stood up and looked down the row. She asked what varieties were planted here, and Ruth pulled her notebook from her back pocket and handed it over. The notebook had every tree numbered, every variety identified or marked unidentified, and the university lab results clipped to the back page. Dr. Rao read through it while Phil walked deeper into the orchard. He found the back rows, the old Pritchard trees from the 1880s, and he stood in front of one that had bloomed in May and was now carrying small green fruit for the first time in decades. He put his hand on the trunk and felt the bark, and then he looked back toward Ruth, who was answering the inspector's questions at the end of the row. He called out and asked how old the rootstock was. Ruth told him at least 80 years, maybe older. He was quiet for a long time, standing in the shade of a tree he had told her to bulldoze 6 months ago, a tree that was alive and green and bearing fruit, while his own recommendations were being pulled out of the ground and burned across the valley. When he came back to the front, Dr. Rao was photographing graft unions and taking tissue samples. She looked at Phil and told him she wanted to come back with a full team because some of these varieties she didn't recognize from the regional registry. If these were unrecorded cultivars with fire blight resistance, that changed the conversation. Phil nodded. He looked at Ruth, and his face had an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something between respect and the uncomfortable awareness that he had been wrong in a way that was now standing in front of him with leaves on it. "The board is going to want to talk about this," he said. Ruth took her notebook back from Dr. Rao and put it in her pocket. "They can talk all they want. I've got grafts to check." The agricultural board met in closed session the following week, and the inspector's report was read aloud to the room. The Pritchard orchard had no fire blight collapse. The mixed varieties, including 2 unrecorded cultivars that the state lab was now running full genetic profiles on, were standing healthy, while the commercial blocks around them were dying or already gone. The debate went the way institutional debates go. Some board members wanted to study the orchard, catalog the varieties, and test them for resistance. Others wanted to call it an anomaly, a lucky break that didn't change the county's planting strategy. because changing the strategy meant admitting that 20 years of recommendations had been building a house on sand. Harold Fenn, the board member who had noticed the green orchard from the road, pushed hardest. He pointed out that the same 5 varieties, planted in block monoculture on dwarfing rootstock, had just lost a third of the county's production in a single season. He asked the room what the plan was if the next blight was worse, or if the streptomycin resistance spread, or if the climate kept shifting toward the warm, wet springs that fire blight loved. Nobody had an answer for that. The board didn't vote to abandon commercial varieties because they weren't ready for that, and Ruth would have been the first to say that commercial varieties had their place. But they did authorize a heritage variety preservation study, using Ruth's orchard as the reference site, and they quietly stopped recommending single variety block planting for new orchards. The next growing season's extension literature included, for the first time, a section on mixed plantings and varietal diversity. Phil Marsh called Ruth for the first time without the clipboard in his voice. He asked if she would be willing to let university researchers collect scionwood from her trees for a resistance study, and Ruth told him she had already been distributing scionwood to other growers who had asked. Small farmers who had lost their commercial blocks were looking for something that would survive, and Ruth had been handing off bundles of cuttings at the feed store since March. She hadn't waited for the board, and she hadn't waited for the study. She'd been giving away unmarked scionwood in damp cloth to anyone who showed up at her door and asked. And when Phil asked how many growers she'd given cuttings to, she told him 11 so far. Phil was quiet on the phone for a while after that. The county diner talk shifted, as it always did when the evidence became too visible to dismiss. Dale Harper told the group at the coffee pot that Ruth Calloway's orchard was the only one in the valley that hadn't lost trees. Someone asked what she was growing, and Dale paused with his cup halfway to his mouth, because he didn't actually know. Nobody had ever asked her. Ruth wasn't at the diner. She was in the orchard, grafting the last of the season's scionwood onto a rootstock that had lost its top to blight but survived at the base. The graft would take or it wouldn't, and either way the variety was already backed up in her nursery, growing in quiet rows that no one from the county had ever visited. The scionwood left her nursery months ago, in unmarked bundles, handed to growers who never asked the county's permission. Those varieties are growing in 11 orchards across the valley now, and the board is still debating what to call them. Some things survive because someone kept grafting while everyone else was still laughing. If you want to hear the next story from the back roads, subscribe.